The morning sun painted golden streaks across the small kitchen window as 73-year-old Robert Washington carefully counted the bills spread across his dining table. His weathered hands, marked by decades of hard labor, moved slowly, but precisely through each stack. $47,000. Every single bill represented years of sacrifice, overtime shifts, and dreams deferred. Robert had been awake since 4 in the morning, unable to sleep from excitement. Today was the day he had been planning for months. His grandson Tommy was graduating from college in 3 days, and Robert was going to drive across 3 states to be there. But this wasn't just any graduation. Tommy was the first person in their family to earn a college degree. The old man smiled as he looked at a photograph taped to his refrigerator. It showed a young boy in an oversized baseball uniform, grinning widely despite missing his front teeth. That same boy was now 22 years old and about to become an engineer. Robert had helped raise Tommy after the boy's father died in a car accident when Tommy was only 8. Those were tough years, but Robert never complained. He just worked harder. For 45 years, Robert had clocked in at the Birmingham steel mill every morning at 6 sharp. Rain or shine, sick or healthy, he was always there. His co-workers respected him because he never caused drama and always helped others when they needed it. When younger workers struggled with the heavy machinery, Robert was there to lend a hand. When someone's family faced hard times, Robert quietly slipped them a few extra dollars. The mill closed permanently 5 years ago when the company moved operations overseas. Robert was 68 then, too old to find another factory job, but too young for full Social Security benefits. Many of his former co-workers fell into depression or turned to drinking. Some lost their homes. Robert took a different path. He found work wherever he could, cleaning offices at night, doing yard work for neighbors, fixing small appliances that people threw away. Robert had always been careful with money, but those final 5 years before retirement taught him to be even more cautious. He learned to stretch every dollar, to find deals at the grocery store, and to repair things instead of replacing them. His friends sometimes joked that he could make a penny scream, but Robert didn't mind. He had a goal, and every dollar saved brought him closer to it. The idea of keeping his money in cash rather than banks came from his childhood. Robert grew up in Alabama during the 1950s and 60s, when many banks wouldn't even serve black customers. His grandmother used to hide money in coffee cans buried in the backyard. His father kept savings in a secret compartment built into their kitchen wall. Trust in financial institutions was something that took generations to build, and Robert's generation had good reasons to be skeptical. Even after banks became more welcoming, Robert preferred cash. He liked being able to see his money, to count it, to know exactly what he had without worrying about fees or account minimums. His small house was paid off. His car was old but reliable, and he lived simply. What did he need a bank for? The money on his table represented more than just savings. It was his legacy. $25,000 was earmarked for Tommy's final semester expenses. The college had sent a bill that made Robert's eyes water, but he was determined to pay it. Tommy had worked part-time jobs throughout school and earned several scholarships, but there was still a gap. Robert would fill that gap. The remaining $22,000 was Tommy's graduation gift, though the young man didn't know it yet. Robert planned to hand it over after the ceremony, along with some advice about saving and investing that he wished someone had given him at that age. This money would give Tommy options, maybe a down payment on a small apartment, or funds to pursue additional training, or just a safety net as he started his career. Robert folded the money carefully and placed it in a large manila envelope. He had considered getting a cashier's check, but the bank would charge fees and ask questions. Besides, he was only driving for 2 days. What could happen? The drive to Tennessee would take about 8 hours, but Robert planned to take his time. He would stop frequently to rest his old bones and maybe visit a few places he remembered from his younger days. His 2008 Honda Civic wasn't fancy, but it was reliable and got good gas mileage. He had maintained it carefully over the years, changing the oil religiously and fixing small problems before they became big ones. As Robert prepared for his trip, he thought about how different Tommy's life would be compared to his own. Tommy would graduate debt-free thanks to Robert's sacrifices. He would start his career with money in his pocket and opportunities that Robert could never have imagined. The young man would never have to choose between buying groceries and paying the electric bill. He would never have to work double shifts, just to make ends meet. This thought filled Robert with quiet satisfaction. He had lived through segregation, economic hardship, and personal loss, but he had persevered. Every blister on his hands, every aching muscle after a long shift, every dollar carefully saved, it had all been worth it to reach this moment. Robert's neighbors in the small community knew about his upcoming trip. Mrs. Johnson from next door had offered to water his small garden while he was away. The teenager down the street would collect his mail. Everyone was excited for Robert because they knew how much this meant to him. Tommy had visited the neighborhood several times over the years, and people remembered him as a polite, smart kid who clearly adored his grandfather. The old man packed his small suitcase with his best clothes, a navy blue suit he had worn to church for years, a crisp white shirt and a tie that Tommy had given him for Christmas. He wanted to look good for the graduation ceremony. He also packed comfortable driving clothes, his medications, and a thermos for coffee. Robert's plan was simple. He would leave early Tuesday morning, drive at a comfortable pace, and stop for the night at a modest motel about halfway to Tennessee. Wednesday would be another easy day of driving, arriving in time to take Tommy out for a nice dinner. Thursday was graduation day, the moment Robert had been dreaming about. As he loaded his suitcase into the Honda, Robert felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. He hadn't taken a trip this long in years, and he wasn't used to carrying so much cash. But the thought of seeing Tommy walk across that stage, diploma in hand, made any worry seem small. The March weather was perfect for driving. Cool but not cold, with clear skies predicted for the next few days. Robert had mapped out his route carefully, choosing highways he was familiar with and avoiding major cities where traffic might be confusing. He preferred the scenic routes anyway, even if they took a little longer. Robert started the Honda and let it warm up while he did a final check of the house. All the windows were locked, the coffee pot was unplugged, and the thermostat was turned down to save energy. The manila envelope with the money sat securely on the passenger seat, where he could keep an eye on it. As he pulled out of his driveway, Robert waved to Mrs. Johnson, who was tending her flower garden. She smiled and called out, "Give Tommy our love." Robert honked his horn twice in acknowledgement. The whole neighborhood was proud of Tommy's achievement. The first hour of driving went smoothly. Robert had his favorite radio station playing old gospel and blues music, and the Honda hummed along reliably. He thought about all the conversations he had had with Tommy over the years, about the importance of education, about treating people with respect, about working hard and saving money. The young man had listened and learned, and now he was about to reap the rewards. Robert also thought about Tommy's future. With an engineering degree and no student debt, the young man would have opportunities that Robert could only dream of. Maybe Tommy would design bridges or buildings that would last for generations. Maybe he would invent something that would help people. Maybe he would start his own company and create jobs for others. Whatever path Tommy chose, Robert knew the young man would make good decisions. Tommy had inherited his grandfather's work ethic and his grandmother's kindness. He was smart, determined, and most importantly, he understood the value of the sacrifices that had been made for him. As Robert drove through the Alabama countryside, passing farms and small towns that reminded him of his youth, he felt a deep sense of the morning was still young, and Robert had many miles ahead of him. But he wasn't in a hurry. This journey was about more than just getting to Tennessee. It was about completing a mission that had taken years to accomplish. Every mile brought him closer to the moment when all his sacrifices would be justified, when he could finally say that he had given Tommy the future he deserved. Robert Washington drove on, unaware that forces beyond his control were about to turn his simple trip into something far more complicated and dangerous than he could ever imagine. Peace. His life had been simple but meaningful. He had worked hard, helped others, and raised a grandson who was about to achieve something remarkable. Not everyone could say they had made such a difference in the world. Officer Dale Morrison, had been having a bad week, and Tuesday morning wasn't starting any better. His shift had begun with a domestic disturbance call that turned into 3 hours of paperwork. His coffee had gone cold while he dealt with a fender bender between two teenagers who couldn't stop arguing about whose fault it was, and his supervisor had already reminded him twice about his monthly quota for traffic citations. Morrison had been a police officer for 12 years, but lately, the job felt more like a burden than a calling. The pay wasn't great, his marriage was struggling, and he felt like the community he was supposed to serve didn't respect him anymore. He had joined the force with dreams of making a difference, but somewhere along the way, those dreams had turned into resentment. At 38 years old, Morrison was still young enough to start a new career, but he felt trapped by his pension, plan, and benefits. His wife Linda worked part-time at a department store, and they had 2 kids in middle school. The family lived paycheck to paycheck, always one unexpected expense away from financial trouble. Morrison often looked at the expensive cars driving through his patrol area and wondered why he was working so hard for so little, while others seemed to have everything handed to them. This morning, Morrison was cruising Highway 85, a long stretch of road that connected several small towns. It was a good spot for speed traps, but traffic had been light all morning. He needed to write at least 5 tickets before his shift ended if he wanted to avoid another lecture from his sergeant about productivity. The blue and white patrol car sat hidden behind a large billboard advertising a local restaurant. Morrison had his radar gun ready and was watching for speeders when he noticed an older Honda Civic approaching. The car was staying exactly at the speed limit, 65 miles per hour, which immediately struck Morrison as suspicious. In his experience, only 2 types of people drove exactly the speed limit: nervous teenagers with new licenses and people who had something to hide. As the Honda passed his hiding spot, Morrison got a clear look at the driver. An elderly black man, probably in his 70s, sat upright behind the wheel with both hands gripping it tightly. The man's focused concentration and rigid posture suggested nervousness to Morrison. More importantly, Morrison noticed something hanging from the rearview mirror. It looked like an air freshener. Morrison's pulse quickened slightly. Air fresheners hanging from rearview mirrors were technically illegal in their state because they could obstruct a driver's view. It was a minor violation that most officers ignored, but it gave Morrison the legal justification he needed to make a traffic stop. And nervous elderly drivers sometimes carried cash. Lots of cash. The patrol car's engine roared to life as Morrison pulled out from behind the billboard. He accelerated quickly to catch up with the Honda, then activated his emergency lights. The bright red and blue flashing immediately filled the older man's mirrors, and Morrison watched as the Honda slowed down and began looking for a safe place to pull over. Robert Washington's heart sank when he saw the police lights in his mirror. He hadn't been speeding. He had been extra careful to follow every traffic law because he was carrying so much cash. But now a police car was behind him, and his hands began to tremble slightly as he guided his Honda onto the shoulder of the highway. The spot where Robert stopped wasn't ideal. They were on a relatively isolated stretch of Highway 85, with thick woods on both sides and no other buildings in sight. The nearest town was still 15 miles away. Robert turned off his engine and placed his hands on the steering wheel, just as his grandson had taught him during Tommy's driver's education classes. Morrison parked his patrol car about 20 feet behind the Honda and took a moment to call in the traffic stop to dispatch. He reported the Honda's license plate number and his location, following standard procedure. Then he stepped out of his car and approached the driver's window, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. Robert rolled down his window as the officer approached. He could see that the policeman was a white man in his late 30s with short brown hair and a serious expression. The name tag on his uniform read Morrison, and his badge gleamed in the morning sunlight. "Good morning, sir," Morrison said, in a professional tone. "Do you know why I stopped you today?" Robert genuinely didn't know. He had been so careful about his speed, and he hadn't changed lanes or done anything unusual. "No, officer, I don't," he replied politely. "Was I speeding? I thought I was going the speed limit." Morrison pointed at the small pine tree air freshener hanging from Robert's rearview mirror. You've got an obstruction hanging from your mirror. There. That's a violation of state law because it can block your view of the road. Robert looked at the air freshener in surprise. He had hung it there months ago and had completely forgotten about it. Oh, I'm sorry, officer. I didn't realize. That was illegal. I can take it down right now if you'd like. I'll need to see your driver's license and registration first, Morrison said, studying Robert's face carefully. The old man seemed genuinely nervous, which Morrison interpreted as suspicious rather than natural anxiety about being pulled over. Robert reached slowly for his wallet, making sure to keep his movements visible to the officer. His hands were shaking slightly as he pulled out his driver's license. The registration was in the glove compartment, and he asked permission before reaching for it. Morrison studied the documents carefully. Robert Washington, age 73, with an address in Birmingham, Alabama. The registration showed the Honda was properly licensed and insured. Everything appeared to be in order, but Morrison wasn't ready to end the traffic stop yet. "Where are you headed today, Mr. Washington?" Morrison asked, returning the documents. "Tennessee, officer. My grandson is graduating from college this Thursday, and I'm driving up for the ceremony." Robert's voice carried obvious pride when he mentioned his grandson. Morrison nodded, but his suspicions were actually increasing rather than decreasing. In his experience, drug dealers often used legitimate-sounding cover stories when they traveled with contraband. A college graduation was exactly the type of wholesome story someone might use to avoid scrutiny. "That's a long drive for someone your age," Morrison commented. "You making the trip alone?" "Yes, sir. It's only about 8 hours total, and I'm taking my time. I was planning to stop at a motel tonight and finish the drive tomorrow." Morrison walked around the Honda, pretending to inspect it for other violations, while actually looking for signs of drug activity. The car was clean and well-maintained, but that didn't mean anything. Smart dealers kept their vehicles in perfect condition to avoid attracting attention. When Morrison returned to the driver's window, his demeanor had shifted slightly. He was still professional, but there was a new edge to his voice. "Mr. Washington, I'm detecting an odor of marijuana coming from your vehicle. Have you been smoking anything today?" Robert's eyes widened in shock. "No, officer. I don't smoke anything. Not cigarettes, not marijuana, nothing. I have asthma, so I stay away from all kinds of smoke." Morrison had made similar claims hundreds of times before, and he knew that the smell of marijuana was nearly impossible to prove or disprove after the fact. It was a useful tool for justifying vehicle searches, especially when he suspected someone was carrying cash or drugs. "Well, I'm smelling something and I'm going to need to search your vehicle," Morrison said firmly. "You can consent to the search, or I can call for a drug dog, but that might take an hour or two." Robert felt his world starting to spin. He knew he hadn't been smoking anything, and he was certain there were no drugs in his car. But the thought of sitting on the side of the highway for hours while waiting for a drug dog was terrifying. He also worried about missing his grandson's graduation if this turned into a long ordeal. "Officer, I promise you there are no drugs in my car," Robert said desperately. "I've never used drugs in my life. I don't even drink alcohol." "Then you shouldn't have any problem with me taking a quick look," Morrison replied. "If there's nothing to hide, this will be over in 5 minutes." Robert's mind raced. He knew he had $47,000 in cash sitting on his passenger seat, and he was terrified of how that would look to the officer. But he also knew he had done nothing wrong, and he hoped that cooperating would get him back on the road quickly. "Okay," Robert said quietly. "You can search the car." Morrison's pulse quickened with excitement, though he kept his expression neutral. He had Robert step out of the vehicle and stand at the rear of the Honda while he conducted the search. Morrison always started with the most obvious places, the glove compartment, under the seats, and the door panels. It was when Morrison looked at the passenger seat that he hit the jackpot. There, sitting in plain view, was a manila envelope that was clearly stuffed with something thick. Morrison picked it up and immediately felt the unmistakable texture of paper money through the envelope. "What's this?" Morrison asked, holding up the envelope. Robert's heart sank. "That's my money, officer. I'm carrying cash to pay for my grandson's college expenses and to give him a graduate 300 miles away in Atlanta, FBI Special Agent Lisa Chen was reviewing surveillance reports when her phone buzzed with an urgent message. The text was from Agent Rodriguez, who was coordinating Operation Greenlight, and it contained, "Just 4 words, we got another one." Agent Chen smiled grimly as she read the details. Officer Dale Morrison had just seized $47,000 in cash during a traffic stop, and every single bill in that money was marked with invisible ultraviolet ink and tracked by serial number. Morrison had walked directly into their trap. Operation Greenlight had been 18 months in the planning. The FBI had received dozens of complaints over the years about police officers in rural southern departments who were allegedly using traffic stops to steal money from travelers. The pattern was always similar. Officers would stop drivers, usually minorities, claim to smell drugs, search vehicles, and seize any cash they found under civil asset forfeiture laws. The problem for investigators was that these cases were difficult to prove. Officers could always claim they genuinely suspected drug activity, and the victims often lacked the resources to fight back through the legal system. Many victims were traveling through unfamiliar areas and had no local connections to help them navigate the complex process of challenging asset forfeiture. But Agent Chen had a different background than most FBI agents. Before joining the Bureau, she had worked as a forensic accountant, tracking money laundering operations for international drug cartels. She understood that money tells a story, and she knew how to make that story visible to investigators. The breakthrough came when Chen realized they could use the civil asset forfeiture system against itself. Instead of trying to catch officers in the act, they could mark money and then track where it went after being seized. If officers were following proper procedures, the marked money would end up in evidence lockers and eventually in government accounts. But if officers were stealing the money for personal use, the marked bills would show up in their personal transactions. Chen had spent months convincing her supervisors to approve Operation Greenlight. The plan required cooperation from multiple banks, careful coordination of surveillance teams, and the patience to wait for corrupt officers to reveal themselves. But once the operation was approved, Chen threw herself into the work with determination. The first step was identifying which banks to include in the operation. Chen's team selected 12 banks in 6 different states, all located in areas where they had received complaints about police corruption. They chose banks that served primarily minority communities, since those were the populations most likely to be targeted by corrupt officers. The second step was more complex, training bank employees to mark money without arousing suspicion. Chen's team developed a system where certain random withdrawals would be processed using bills that had been pre-treated with invisible UV ink. The bank employees would photograph the serial numbers of these bills and upload them to a secure FBI database. Customers had no idea their money was being tracked. It was completely invisible and didn't affect the bills in any way. The UV ink was only detectable under special blacklight conditions, and it would glow bright green when exposed to the right wavelength. More importantly, the ink would transfer to anything that came into contact with the marked bills: hands, clothing, other surfaces. If someone handled marked money and then touched other objects, those objects would also glow under UV light. Robert Washington's withdrawal 3 days earlier had been randomly selected for marking as part of this system. When he visited his bank in Birmingham to withdraw $47,000 in cash, the teller had unknowingly given him bills that had been treated with UV ink the night before. Every $20, $50, and $100 bill in Robert's envelope was now a piece of evidence waiting to be activated. Agent Rodriguez had been monitoring police radio traffic in Morrison's patrol area as part of the surveillance operation. When Morrison called in his traffic stop involving Robert's Honda, Rodriguez immediately recognized the license plate number from the bank's withdrawal report. She quickly dispatched surveillance teams to the area, but they arrived too late to witness the actual seizure. However, the surveillance teams were able to follow Morrison after he left the traffic stop. Instead of driving directly to his police station to log the seized money as evidence, Morrison made a detour to a gas station where he parked behind the building and spent several minutes in his patrol car. Surveillance photos showed him opening the envelope and counting the money. This behavior was already suspicious, but it got worse. Morrison's next stop should have been the police station, but instead he drove to his bank. Surveillance teams watched as Morrison entered the bank carrying a small bag and left empty-handed 20 minutes later. Bank records would later show that Morrison had deposited $15,000 in cash into his personal checking account that afternoon. Agent Chen was monitoring the situation from the FBI field office in Atlanta. As reports came in from the surveillance teams, she felt the familiar excitement that came with watching a complex investigation come together. Morrison was behaving exactly as they had hoped. He was so confident in his ability to steal with impunity that he wasn't even trying to hide his actions. The beauty of Operation Greenlight was that it didn't rely on witness testimony or complex legal arguments about police procedures. The marked money would tell the story by itself. If Morrison had followed proper protocols, the UV-marked bills would be sitting in an evidence locker at the police station. But if Morrison had stolen the money, those same bills would be glowing under blacklight in his personal possessions. Over the next 24 hours, Morrison's behavior became even more incriminating. Surveillance teams documented him using cash to pay for groceries, gas, and the expensive dinner at a steakhouse. Each transaction potentially involved marked bills, and each transaction was photographed and documented by federal agents. The most damaging evidence came on Wednesday evening, when Morrison gave his girlfriend Patricia $5,000 in cash for a shopping trip. Surveillance teams followed Patricia to 3 different stores, where she used the cash to buy designer clothes, jewelry, and electronics. If any of that money was marked with UV ink, it would prove that Morrison was using seized funds for personal expenses. Agent Chen knew they had enough evidence to arrest Morrison immediately, but she wanted to gather as much information as possible about his pattern of behavior. The goal wasn't just to catch one corrupt officer, it was to expose an entire system of corruption and to gather evidence that could be used to prosecute other officers who might be involved. Chen's team had been investigating Morrison specifically for 8 months. They had identified at least 12 other traffic stops where Morrison had seized cash under suspicious circumstances. The total amount of money involved was over $200,000, but until now, they hadn't been able to prove that. Morrison was keeping the money for personal use rather than following proper evidence procedures. The victims in these cases painted a disturbing picture of Morrison's behavior. Almost all of them were minorities traveling through unfamiliar areas. Morrison typically claimed to smell marijuana, searched their vehicles, and seized any cash he found. He rarely arrested anyone, and he almost never found any actual drugs. The pattern was clear to investigators, but proving it in court had been nearly impossible. What made Morrison's crimes particularly cruel was that he seemed to target people who were least likely to fight back. Elderly travelers, families with children, people who didn't speak English as their first language. These were the victims Morrison preferred because he knew they were unlikely to have the resources or knowledge to challenge asset forfeiture procedures. Robert Washington fit Morrison's typical victim profile perfectly. He was elderly, traveling alone, carrying cash, and unfamiliar with the local legal system. Morrison had probably assumed that Robert would be too intimidated or too poor to challenge the seizure. What Morrison didn't realize was that Robert's case would be different from all the others. Agent Chen had been personally touched by Robert's story when she read the surveillance report. Here was a man who had worked his entire life to help his grandson achieve something Morrison would never appreciate: a college education earned through sacrifice and determination. Morrison had stolen Robert's American dream and felt completely justified in doing so. But Chen also felt a cold satisfaction as she reviewed the evidence against Morrison. The officer had been so arrogant, so confident in his immunity from consequences, that he had made mistake after mistake. Every transaction involving the marked money was being documented. Every time Morrison touched those bills, he was leaving invisible evidence on his hands and clothing. The FBI had learned from previous civil asset forfeiture investigations that corrupt officers often kept detailed records of their illegal seizures. They treated stolen money like any other form of income, carefully tracking how much they took and how they spent it. Morrison would likely have records of all his illegal activities hidden somewhere in his home or office. As Wednesday turned into Thursday, Chen's team prepared to spring their trap. They had search warrants ready for Morrison's home, his bank accounts, and his patrol car. The Thursday morning began like any other day for Officer Dale Morrison. He showered, ate breakfast with his family, and kissed his wife Linda goodbye before heading to work. He had no idea that FBI surveillance teams were already positioned around his house, documenting his every move with high-powered cameras and audio equipment. Morrison felt good as he drove to the police station. The $15,000 he had deposited into his bank account 2 days earlier had already cleared, and he was looking forward to paying off some overdue bills. His wife had been nagging him about their credit card debt, and now he could finally give her some good news about their finances. What Morrison didn't know was that FBI forensic accountants had been analyzing his financial records for months. They had identified dozens of suspicious deposits that coincided with his asset forfeiture seizures. The pattern was clear to investigators. Morrison would seize money during traffic stops, deposit a portion into his personal accounts, and spend the rest on cash purchases that couldn't be traced. At the FBI field office in Atlanta, Agent Chen was coordinating the final phase of Operation Greenlight. Her team had spent the night preparing search warrants and arrest documentation. The evidence against Morrison was overwhelming, but Chen wanted to be absolutely certain they had covered every possible angle before moving forward. The surveillance reports from the past 48 hours painted a picture of breathtaking arrogance. Morrison had not only stolen Robert Washington's money, but he had immediately begun spending it on personal expenses. FBI agents had documented him using cash to pay for gas, groceries, restaurant meals, and gifts for his girlfriend. Each transaction potentially involved marked bills that would glow under ultraviolet light. Agent Rodriguez was reviewing the bank surveillance footage from Morrison's deposit on Tuesday afternoon. The video clearly showed Morrison entering the Yuan bank with a small bag and counting out $15,000 in cash for the teller. Bank records confirmed that the money had been deposited into Morrison's personal checking account, not into any police department account. This was a crucial piece of evidence because it proved Morrison's intent to steal, rather than simply mishandle, evidence. Police officers were required to deposit seized assets into special government accounts, not their personal bank accounts. Morrison's decision to put the money into his own account was clear proof that he knew he was committing theft. But the FBI's case went far beyond just Robert's money. Chen's team had been building a comprehensive file on Morrison's pattern of corruption over the past 8 months. They had identified 23 separate traffic stops where Morrison had seized cash under suspicious circumstances. In most cases, Morrison claimed to smell marijuana but never found any actual drugs. The total amount of stolen money exceeded $300,000. The victims in these cases had been carefully interviewed by FBI agents over the past several months. Their stories were remarkably consistent. Morrison would stop them for minor traffic violations, claim to detect drug odors, search their vehicles, and seize any cash he found. He typically let the victims go without arrest, keeping their money under civil asset forfeiture laws. One particularly heartbreaking case involved a young mother named Jennifer, who was traveling to visit her sick father in the hospital. Morrison had seized $8,000 that Jennifer was carrying to help pay for her father's medical expenses. When Jennifer tried to challenge the seizure, she was told the process would take months and require hiring an attorney she couldn't afford. She eventually gave up and never saw her money again. Another victim was an elderly veteran named Frank who was carrying his disability payments in cash because he didn't trust banks. Morrison seized $12,000 from Frank during a traffic stop, claiming the money was suspicious because it was mostly small bills. Frank spent his life savings trying to hire a lawyer to get his money back, but the legal process was so complex and expensive that he eventually lost everything. These stories had motivated Agent Chen to work tirelessly on Operation Greenlight. Police officers who abused their authority to steal from innocent people represented everything that was wrong with corruption in law enforcement. Chen was determined to ensure that Morrison faced serious consequences for his crimes. The technical aspects of the investigation were equally impressive. The FBI's forensic team had developed new methods for tracking marked currency that went far beyond traditional surveillance techniques. The ultraviolet ink used to mark Robert's money was specially formulated to transfer to anything it touched, creating an invisible trail that could be followed for weeks. When Morrison handled the marked bills, microscopic amounts of the UV ink transferred to his hands. When he touched other objects, his steering wheel, his cell phone, his wallet, those objects also became contaminated with the ink. Even after washing his hands multiple times, traces of the ink remained under his fingernails and in the creases of his skin. The FBI had tested this technology extensively before using it in Operation Greenlight. They knew that UV ink could remain detectable for up to 30 days under the right conditions. This meant that even if Morrison had spent all of Robert's money, they would still be able to prove he had handled those specific bills. Agent Chen was particularly proud of another innovative aspect of their investigation. Her team had used artificial intelligence to analyze Morrison's spending patterns and compare them to his official income. The AI system had identified dozens of purchases that Morrison couldn't possibly afford on his police salary, including expensive jewelry, electronics, and restaurant meals. This financial analysis revealed the true scope of Morrison's corruption. Over the past 3 years, he had spent nearly $100,000 more than his legitimate income would support. The extra money had to come from somewhere, and the FBI's investigation had identified asset forfeiture as the most likely source. Meanwhile, Robert Washington was struggling with the devastating loss of his life savings. After Morrison seized his money, Robert had continued his drive to Tennessee, but he was no longer excited about his grandson's graduation. He spent Wednesday night in a cheap motel, too upset to eat dinner, wondering how he would explain to Tommy that there was no money for college expenses or graduation gifts. Robert had tried calling the police station to ask about getting his money back, but the desk sergeant told him he would need to file paperwork and wait for the legal process to run its course. When Robert asked how long that would take, the sergeant said it could be months or even years. Robert felt helpless and defeated. But Robert's case was different from Morrison's previous victims in one crucial way. Agent Rodriguez had been monitoring police radio traffic when Morrison called in the traffic stop. The FBI immediately recognized Robert's license plate from their bank surveillance records and began tracking Morrison's subsequent actions. Agent Rodriguez had actually called Robert on Wednesday evening, identifying herself as an FBI agent and asking to meet with him about his traffic stop. Robert was initially suspicious. He had never spoken to an FBI agent before and wasn't sure if the call was legitimate. But Agent Rodriguez was patient and understanding, and she eventually convinced Robert to meet with her Thursday morning. The meeting between Robert and Agent Rodriguez took place at a small diner near Robert's motel. Rodriguez explained that Robert's money had been marked as part of an FBI investigation into police corruption. She told Robert that they had been tracking Morrison for months, and that his case might be the key to bringing Morrison to justice. Robert was amazed to learn that his money had been marked by the FBI. He had withdrawn the cash from his local bank just 3 days earlier, and he had no idea that federal agents were tracking those specific bills. Agent Rodriguez explained how the invisible ink worked and how it would help prove that Morrison had stolen the money for personal use. More importantly, Agent Rodriguez assured Robert that the FBI would do everything possible to recover his money and arrest Morrison for theft. This was the first hopeful news Robert had heard since his encounter with Morrison, and he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders as he realized he might actually get justice. The interview with Robert provided crucial details that strengthened the FBI's case against Morrison. Robert was able to give a detailed account of the traffic stop, including Morrison's claim about smelling marijuana and his aggressive behavior during the vehicle search. Robert's testimony would be powerful evidence of Morrison's pattern of targeting innocent travelers. Agent Rodriguez also arranged for Robert to wear a wire during any future contact with Morrison or other police officers. If Morrison tried to contact Robert about the seized money, the FBI would be able to record any incriminating statements he might make. By Thursday afternoon, Agent Chen felt confident that they had gathered enough evidence to arrest Morrison and execute search warrants. The surveillance teams reported that Morrison was following his normal routine, which suggested he had no idea he was being investigated. This was crucial because it meant Morrison hadn't had time to hide evidence or dispose of The arrest of Officer Dale Morrison took place at exactly 6:30 Thursday evening, just as he was sitting down to dinner with his family. The sound of car doors slamming in his driveway made Morrison look up from his plate, and through the window he saw something that made his blood run cold. FBI agents in bulletproof vests were walking toward his front door. Agent Chen had chosen the timing deliberately. She wanted Morrison to be relaxed and unprepared when federal agents arrived. The element of surprise was crucial to prevent Morrison from destroying evidence or fabricating explanations for what they were about to find. When the doorbell rang, Morrison's wife Linda answered it, expecting to see a neighbor or delivery person. Instead, she found herself facing Agent Rodriguez, who politely showed her FBI credentials and asked to speak with her husband. Linda's shocked expression told Morrison that his life was about to change forever. "Dale Morrison, you're under arrest for deprivation of rights under color of law, theft of federal funds, and conspiracy," Agent Rodriguez announced as Morrison was led out of his house in handcuffs. His wife and children watched in horror from the doorway as their husband and father was placed in the back of an FBI vehicle. The arrest was just the beginning. While Morrison was being transported to federal holding facility, FBI search teams were executing warrants at his home, his workplace, and his personal vehicle. Agent Chen personally supervised the search of Morrison's house, where they quickly found evidence that exceeded even her expectations. In Morrison's garage, hidden inside a toolbox, agents discovered $28,000 in cash. When Agent Chen shined a UV light on the money, dozens of bills glowed bright green, proof that they had come from Robert Washington's envelope. Morrison had been so confident that he would never be caught that he hadn't even tried to hide the stolen money properly. The search of Morrison's home computer revealed even more damaging evidence. Morrison had kept detailed digital records of his asset forfeiture seizures, including photos of the cash he had stolen and notes about his victims. One file contained over 50 photographs of money Morrison had seized, along with crude comments about the people he had robbed. Even more shocking was Morrison's attitude toward his victims. His computer files revealed that he specifically targeted minority travelers because he believed they were less likely to fight back legally. He had written detailed profiles of ideal victims, describing elderly people and families with children as easy marks, who wouldn't challenge asset forfeiture procedures. Agent Chen felt sick reading Morrison's notes about Robert Washington. Morrison had written, "Old black guy with $47K cash claimed it was for grandson's college. Yeah, right. These people always have sob stories. Easy money. He'll never see a lawyer." The callousness of Morrison's words made Agent Chen more determined than ever to ensure he faced serious consequences. This wasn't just theft. It was a systematic pattern of targeting vulnerable people based on their race and circumstances. The search of Morrison's bank records revealed the full scope of his corruption. Over the past 3 years, Morrison had deposited nearly $200,000 in cash into various personal accounts. The deposits almost always occurred within days of asset forfeiture seizures, making the connection obvious to investigators. Morrison's spending patterns were equally revealing. He had used stolen money to pay for vacations, expensive dinners, jewelry for his girlfriend, and even home improvements. FBI forensic accountants calculated that Morrison had spent over $150,000 more than his legitimate police salary would support. The evidence against Morrison was so overwhelming that his defense attorney immediately began discussing plea negotiations. Federal prosecutors made it clear that Morrison was facing decades in prison if convicted at trial, and they had no interest in offering lenient plea deals for civil rights violations. Meanwhile, Robert Washington was experiencing a mixture of relief and vindication that he had never expected. Agent Rodriguez had called him Thursday night to inform him of Morrison's arrest and to assure him that his money would be returned. For the first time in days, Robert felt hope that justice might actually be served. The story of Morrison's arrest quickly became national news when the FBI released body camera footage from Robert's original traffic stop. The video showed Morrison's aggressive behavior and his dismissive attitude toward Robert's explanation about the money being for college expenses. Public outrage was immediate and intense. Civil rights organizations seized on the case as an example, of systemic racism in police asset forfeiture practices. Legal experts pointed out that Morrison's victims were overwhelmingly minorities, and that the civil asset forfeiture system made it nearly impossible for innocent people to recover their stolen property. The media attention brought forward dozens of additional victims who had been robbed by Morrison over the years. People who had been too intimidated or too poor to challenge their asset seizures suddenly found themselves with pro bono legal representation and FBI agents who took their complaints seriously. Jennifer, the young mother whose medical money had been stolen, was among those who came forward. She had given up hope of ever seeing her $8,000 again, but now the FBI was promising to help her recover every penny that Morrison had stolen from her. Frank, the elderly veteran who had lost his disability payments, was another victim who found new hope. His story was particularly heartbreaking because he had spent his life savings trying to hire lawyers to get his money back. Now he learned that Morrison had spent Frank's disability money on jewelry and expensive restaurants. The trial of Dale Morrison became a landmark case in civil rights law. Federal prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of Morrison's systematic theft from innocent travelers, supported by the innovative UV tracking technology that had made the case possible. Morrison's defense team tried to argue that he had genuinely believed the seized money was connected to drug activity, but the evidence against him was too strong. His own computer files contained admissions that he knew his victims were innocent, and his spending patterns proved he was keeping the money for personal use rather than following proper evidence procedures. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Agent Chen demonstrated the UV tracking technology in open court. Under normal lighting, bills from Robert's original envelope looked completely normal. But when Chen turned on a blacklight, the courtroom gasped as dozens of bills glowed bright green. Chen then used the same UV light on items seized from Morrison's house, his wallet, his car keys, his cell phone, even his clothing. Everything glowed with traces of the marked ink, proving beyond any doubt that Morrison had personally handled Robert's money. Robert Washington testified about the traffic stop and its devastating impact on his life. His quiet dignity and obvious honesty made a powerful impression on the jury. When Robert described how he had worked double shifts for decades to save money for his grandson's education, several jurors were visibly moved. Tommy Washington also testified, describing how his grandfather had sacrificed everything to help him achieve his dreams of becoming an engineer. Tommy's testimony helped the jury understand the human cost of Morrison's crimes, not just the theft of money, but the destruction of a family's dreams and aspirations. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding Morrison guilty on all charges. The verdict was unanimous, and several jurors later said they were appalled by the evidence of Morrison's systematic targeting of minority victims. At his sentencing hearing, Morrison finally showed some remorse for his actions. He apologized to his victims and claimed he had been under financial stress that led him to make poor decisions. But federal prosecutors argued that Morrison's crimes were too serious and too systematic to warrant leniency. Judge Patricia Williams sentenced Morrison to 15 years in federal prison, calling his crimes a betrayal of the public trust that strikes at the heart of our justice system. She also ordered Morrison to pay full restitution to all his victims, totaling over $300,000. The Morrison case led to significant reforms in civil asset forfeiture procedures. Congress passed new laws requiring stronger evidence before police could seize property, and many states implemented additional oversight measures to prevent abuse. The FBI's Operation Greenlight expanded to other regions, using the UV tracking technology to investigate police corruption in dozens of departments across the country. Agent Chen became a national expert on police corruption cases and helped train other investigators in the innovative techniques her team had developed. For Robert Washington, the resolution of the case brought more than just financial recovery. The FBI returned his original $47,000, plus interest and additional compensation for his suffering. But more importantly, Robert had the satisfaction of knowing that Morrison would never victimize anyone else. Robert was able to attend his grandson's graduation ceremony after all, and the story of his fight for justice made Tommy even more proud of his grandfather. Tommy graduated debt-free thanks to Robert's sacrifices, and he used some of the settlement money to start his engineering career. With the additional compensation from the city settlement, Robert